ahead of their time, dealing with themes of raw sexuality, underground bootlegging, and the harsh realities of prostitution during the Great Depression. She wrote songs that were raw, unfiltered accounts of urban street life that the polite establishment wanted to pretend did not exist. These women were not just singers, they were entrepreneurs, writers, and cultural rebels who laid down the template for the modern music superstar. Chapter 4: The Great Migration and the Electric Revolution. By the late 1930s and 1940s, the landscape of America was changing rapidly. Millions of Black Americans were fleeing the segregation, violence, and economic stagnation of the rural South in a movement known as the Great Migration. They packed their bags, boarded trains, and moved to northern and midwestern industrial cities like Chicago, New York, and Detroit to find work in factories, steel mills, and auto plants. When the blues musicians from Mississippi arrived in Chicago, they brought their acoustic guitars with them. But they quickly ran into a major problem. The south side of Chicago was incredibly loud. The streets were filled with the sounds of elevated trains, heavy machinery, shouting crowds, and bustling traffic. When a musician tried to sit on a street corner or play in a packed, smoky neighborhood tavern with an acoustic guitar, nobody could hear them over the noise of the city. The solution to this problem completely changed the trajectory of global music history. Musicians like Muddy Waters, who had grown up playing acoustic slide guitar on a Mississippi plantation, decided to plug their instruments into electrical amplifiers. The electric blues was born. Muddy Waters took the old, Delta-style slide guitar and turned up the volume, creating a heavy, distorted, driving sound that echoed through the brick walls of Chicago's clubs. He put together a full band, adding an electric bass, a pounding drum kit, a piano, and an amplified harmonica played by masters like Little Walter. Little Walter would cup a small microphone in his hands right against the harmonica, plugging it into a guitar amplifier turned up so high that it distorted the sound, making the harmonica sound like a roaring saxophone or a screaming electric guitar. This new Chicago blues sound was aggressive, urban, and electrifying. It reflected the energy of a people who had escaped the fields and were now forging a new identity in the concrete jungle. Another massive figure of this era was Chester Burnett, better known as Howlin' Wolf. Standing over 6 feet 3 inches tall and weighing nearly 300 pounds, Howlin' Wolf had a voice that sounded like gravel grinding in a blender. He would perform with an intense, wild energy, rolling around on the stage, climbing up the curtains, and pointing his guitar at the audience like a weapon. At the same time, Willie Dixon was working behind the scenes at Chess Records as a bassist, producer, and songwriter. Dixon wrote almost all of the classic hits for Muddy Waters and Howlin' Wolf, including songs like Hoochie Coochie Man, I Just Want to Make Love to You, and Spoonful. Dixon famously said, "The blues is the roots, the rest is the fruits." He was entirely right. Without this electric revolution on the south side of Chicago, modern rock and roll, heavy metal, and hip-hop would simply not exist. Chapter 5: The Transatlantic Hijacking. As the 1950s turned into the 1960s, the electric blues began to decline in popularity among young Black American audiences who were moving toward the upbeat, polished sounds of Motown, soul, and rhythm and blues. The legendary bluesmen of Chicago and the Delta were struggling to find gigs, often forcing them to take manual labor jobs just to pay their rent. Muddy Waters was delivering plaster, and others were working as truck drivers or janitors. But thousands of miles away, across the Atlantic Ocean, a cultural explosion was brewing. In post-World War II Great Britain, young teenagers were discovering American blues records. Because these records were rare and expensive import items, kids in London, Liverpool, and Manchester would gather in small apartments to listen to scratchy vinyl copies of Robert Johnson, Muddy Waters, and Howlin' Wolf over and over again, treating them like sacred texts. Young British musicians like Keith Richards, Mick Jagger, Eric Clapton, Jimmy Page, and John Mayall became obsessed with replicating the American blues sound. When Mick Jagger and Keith Richards ran into each other at a train station in 1961, they started talking because Jagger was holding a copy of a Muddy Waters record under his arm. They formed a band and named it the Rolling Stones, choosing the title directly from Muddy Waters' 1948 song, Rollin' Stone. When these British bands started playing, they took the heavy structures of Chicago blues, sped them up, turned the amplifiers up even louder, and marketed it as rock and roll or the British invasion. They conquered the American music charts, selling millions of records to white teenagers who had absolutely no idea that this new music was actually just a cover version of Black American folk music created decades earlier in their own country. The hidden irony of this era is that the British musicians did not want to hide their influences, they actually worshipped the original bluesmen. When the Rolling Stones came to America to tour in 1964, they refused to play on the popular television show Shindig unless the producers brought on Muddy Waters as a special guest. The producers did not even know who Muddy Waters was, but they complied to keep the British stars happy. Similarly, when Led Zeppelin recorded their massive early hits, songs like Whole Lotta Love and Lemon Song were heavily lifted, note for note and lyric for lyric, from old blues songs by Willie Dixon and Robert Johnson. This transatlantic exchange created a massive financial windfall for the record companies, but the original creators of the music rarely saw a dime of the royalties, living out their later years in relative obscurity while young European bands became multimillionaires playing their songs. Chapter 6: The Subversive Impact on Civil Rights. The hidden history of the blues is not just a musical history, it is a political one. Long before the civil rights movement of the 1950s and 60s gained national traction, blues musicians were performing dangerous acts of social integration across America. During the height of segregation, music venues were strictly divided. Black audiences were relegated to balconies or separate nights, or barred completely from white-owned clubs. But the power of the blues music was so intoxicating that it began to break down these physical and social walls. In the 1930s and 40s, white teenagers and college students began sneaking into black neighborhood venues or hanging around outside the windows of dance halls just to hear the music. Furthermore, the blues circuit, often referred to as the Chitlin Circuit, was a network of performance venues throughout the South and Midwest that were safe for black entertainers to perform in during segregation. Traveling this circuit was incredibly perilous. Musicians had to drive hundreds of miles through hostile territory where they were not allowed to eat in restaurants, stay in hotels, or use public restrooms. To combat this, the blues community created its own secret infrastructure. Musicians passed around word-of-mouth recommendations of safe houses, private homes where local black families would cook them meals and let them sleep on their couches. This network laid the groundwork for the hospitality and communication systems that civil rights organizers would later use to transport activists during the freedom rides and voter registration drives. The lyrics of the blues also grew more overtly political, though still disguised enough to avoid total censorship. Big Bill Broonzy recorded a song called Black, Brown, and White, which explicitly detailed the systemic job discrimination faced by black Americans, using the refrain, "If you are white, you are all right. If you are brown, stick around. But if you are black, oh brother, get back, get back, get back." J.B. Lenore recorded songs criticizing the Korean War and the systemic racism of American society, performing in a full zebra print tuxedo to mock the absurdity of the entertainment industry. The blues gave voice to the pain, anger, and resilience of an oppressed people, serving as a sonic protest that laid the emotional foundation for the fight for equality. Chapter 7: The Legacy and Modern Beats. Today, the classic 12-bar blues format might seem like a relic of the past, something you only hear in specialized clubs or old movies. But the DNA of the blues is hidden inside almost every modern track you listen to, regardless of the genre. When hip-hop emerged in the 1970s in the Bronx, the foundational concept was built on sampling and looping rhythmic breaks from old funk, soul, and blues records. The practice of rapping over a beat is a direct modern evolution of the old African-American tradition of the talking blues, where a musician would speak rhythmically over a steady guitar groove instead of singing. Early bluesmen like Lightnin' Hopkins and John Lee Hooker were essentially rapping over their acoustic guitars in the 1940s, telling long, improvisational stories about their lives, their struggles, and their triumphs. The emotional core of hip-hop and the blues is identical. Both genres were created by marginalized urban youth using minimal resources to tell raw, uncensored stories about their reality, police brutality, economic hardship, and the desire for a better life. When you hear a modern rap artist use a distorted, heavy bass line or a mournful vocal sample in the background of a track, you are hearing a direct sonic lineage that stretches straight back to the mud of the Mississippi Delta. Even pop music, heavy metal, and electronic dance music rely on the blues scale, a specific sequence of musical notes that includes the blue note, a slightly flattened or lowered pitch that creates tension, longing, and emotional release. Without that single note, modern music would sound flat, cheerful, and completely devoid of soul. The hidden history of the blues is a story of alchemy. It is the story of a people who took the absolute worst conditions human beings could endure, slavery, segregation, poverty, and violence, and spun it into a golden cultural inheritance that conquered the entire world. It is a testament to the power of human expression, a reminder that true art is not born in comfort, but in the fierce, unyielding will to survive. Every time an electric guitar screams, a bass drops, or a vocalist lets out a raw, unfiltered cry, the ghosts of the Delta are still speaking.